Daddy decided in the summertime, he and a couple of the other kids decided to go down and enlist, but they didn't get taken in until December of 1942. He and Mom got a little rental house over near San Pedro Park. After Mother left Somerset, she was going to play happy housewife and then realized that Dad would soon be gone and she needed a job. And she found a cousin that lived out at Sayers, Texas, said that they needed a school teacher out there. So she thought, well, that would get started. So she was kind of a substitute teacher. And then the school principal was called up. So since she was the only teacher out there that had a bachelor's degree, they asked her if she would be principal of that school. So she got to be principal for several months until they could hire a new one. Daddy was gone by now. She got a job at Kelly Field working as an engine aircraft inspector. Who knew? And one of the things she wanted to do, since she was now working with aircraft, was to learn how to fly, what aircraft did. And there was a little airport, Calabria Road. It would have been inside Loop 1604 now. And she went out there and learned how to fly, spent many hours. I think she's told me she was 6 hours of solo flying away from getting her license. This down here is, my brother knows more about this than I, but a fellow that June worked with out at Kelly, and one of the guys who had come from the Philippines when that was taken, found work out there and appreciated what Mom was doing and gave her this silk neck whatever. And I think it was pretty special to her, and because that organization, that fifth whatever, had been in the Philippines during the Japanese invasion. Dad's sister Thelma was born in 1923, and by 1941, when the war was starting, her boyfriend Calvin Wilhelm, who was from Somerset, there had a farm out on Benton City Road, northeast of Somerset. And I think Mr. Wilhelm, his dad, had a pig farm pretty close to the Somerset city limits on the west side of town. He was also a barber in Somerset, I understand. Calvin, his son, went into the Merchant Marines and was in school learning to be a Merchant Marine in Florida. And I think he let Thelma know that it was, that he was back on leave, and they got married. And when she went back, and she stayed there in Florida for several months, and their first son, Joseph Calvin Wilhelm, was born there. She came back after a while to take care of the kids and to help her mom and probably help her mother-in-law also. But it was just an interesting time. I mean, I can't imagine being on a farm, having to do farm work without the guys around, and then have to deal with all of the war provisions that you couldn't get anymore, and you had to learn how to grow it yourself. Their other brother, the baby brother, is Kenneth, and he was born in 1925. He was, in this picture, he had to be the man of the family and do the farming like everybody else needed to do when the older brothers and uncles that could still be in the military were headed off for service. And this is a picture of him, probably towards the mid 1940s, but it's not. It's the same kind of peanut farming that they had for years. It's dusty, nasty work. You have to dig up the peanuts and that sand, and you toss them to get the sand off of them, and there's dust blowing, and it's miserable, hot, nasty work. And he worked with a crew. Sometimes I never heard that he ever was head of a crew, but he was always working with many of the other guys to harvest peanuts. And sometimes the peanuts could be baled into hay, and sometimes they were just left to dry so that you could feed them for feed or send them to wherever market needed them. My favorite thing to do was to go out to my dad's uncles when I was, 5 or 6 years old, and they would have big sacks as big as I was. And I could reach in there and maneuver around and dig out a few of the husked peanuts and then break them open and eat raw peanuts. I didn't know there was such a terrible thing. Here I go. We had a neighbor in 1970s who moved in from California, and I had just bought some peanuts from the store, raw peanuts that I was going to make something with, and I never thought about, when I went to the store and saw the name raw peanuts, I started laughing. Anyway, I brought them home, and she was asking me, well, what you making? I said, well, these raw peanuts. You're eating raw peanuts? And just went, it was almost as if she'd seen the hog's head I had in the sink the Thanksgiving before to make tamales for Christmas. Anyway, she learned a lot, I guess, being my next door neighbor, and we still are friends. But with the peanuts, we could make peanut brittle. Mother would sometimes grind it up to make a peanut butter, so it wasn't much, but so we could see how peanut butter was made. But we learned a lot about peanuts, but I never had to go out and thrash any. My brothers didn't either, but Dad and Uncle Kenneth had a lifetime, probably before they were 20 years old, of enough peanuts that they never wanted to see another one in their life if that could help it. Daddy worked at Fairmaid Bakery through the summer and into the fall, and then in December he was called up to Great Lakes Training Station, and he spent January in the snow north of Chicago. All he said was that we'd be out in our skivvies doing exercises and whatever in the snow, and he said it wasn't as cold as I thought it was going to be. And they would go on leave if they wouldn't get it, and with Mo Bandy's daddy. Mo Bandy's daddy would take his guitar, and they'd be on the streets, and Mo Bandy's daddy would be entertaining everybody, telling jokes and like he would on stage, and Dad was on the side. I've taught that boy everything he knew, type of humor. So they had a good time together up in Great Lakes and Chicago. Regarding Dad's ship, the Cape Henlopen, One of the things I learned from Dad about the Cape Henlopen was the captain was a Norwegian captain. He had been born in Norway at least, and his name was Trygve Angel, Trygve, Trig for short, I'm sure, Angel. He came over as an 8-year-old kid in 1903, and in the late 20s and 30s, he's a sailor on ships with the United Fruit Company. I found immigration and naturalization records that I didn't realize would be there. Not only his arrival from Norway in the early 1900s with his family, but every trip he made or many of the trips he made with the United Fruit Company from Honduras or Nicaragua, bringing in bananas, I guess, with other fruits to New Orleans. And he was in his late 20s to late 30s, and then I didn't see him anymore for after 37 or so. And the next I saw of him, he was a master, and that's the naval equivalent of a captain. So he had done all of his chores of learning how to be a good sailor and learning how to master a ship all by himself. Received his American citizenship in the late 30s. I have not found that yet, but by the 1941-42, he is working on ships, sailing them for the United States, not necessarily the Navy, because he's working on freighters and so forth. When the United States realizes that they need some protection, then the armed guards are created, and the ships are fitted with armament, and then a U.S. Navy crew to man the guns to protect the ship. And Dad was one of those. It was a brand new ship. They had taken it out in January probably of 1943. But in coming back in through Hampton Roads, another ship whose name I don't remember, but it's something Lukenbach, because I remember from the little town up the road that's so famous. And it is now a famous dive spot off northern Virginia coastline that I assume that a lot of our sailors get to visit when they are out there learning how to dive and then practice diving. But the Cape Henlopen made it on in with minimal damage. It was repaired through February, March, and April, and by summertime it was ready to hit the road again. And that is evidently when the captain got his orders to sail by itself, nobody else in convoy, to Iran to deliver some secret goods. The trip they made was, as I said, was solo, and it took them around the world, and it took them about 6 or 7 months to do so. And I learned from Ancestry.com records that consulates had to sign off on when ships made port in peacetime or wartime, and who was on board, and the date and time to the second almost that when they arrived, and then when they left. So I was able to find some of those records to figure out. It took them, was a little over 6 months. The 2 lieutenants on the Cape Henlopen. One of the other jobs that the U.S. Navy sailors had to do is to teach the crew of the Cape Henlopen, or whatever ship they were sailing on, how to shoot those guns also. In case something happened to the U.S. Navy sailors, then the crew from the freighter had to jump in there and pull a trigger or two. There was a specialized crew for each one. When you manned the guns, then you went to your gun tub and your anti-aircraft gun or your big gun on the aft ship, part of the ship. There was hell to pay if somebody was after you, because those guys knew how to shoot. One of the toys that Daddy gave to us were these communications devices. I don't know if they came off the ship or if they came from the Navy Reserve that was down near the post office garage. But in the early 50s, when we were just little kids, Dad had one that had the earphones and then the little microphone, that the speaker that sat on your chest on a little platform. And then he had a cord that ran the length of the house to our bedrooms and so forth. So Peggy, come to the kitchen, something like that. We had more fun for several months until we kind of outgrew them. But I appreciate that they worked on ship too. They went down south to the Panama Canal. I found Dad's story and I thought, well, I'll read it in his words. On those long stretches of ocean from Panama to across the Pacific, we all had lots of time off on our watch. I worked in the ship's machine shop with some of the older sailors who showed me how to make rings out of coins that had lots of silver in them. We'd make rings out of Panamanian silver dollars or silver 50-cent pieces by repeatedly tapping the edges of the soft silver dollar with a spoon. Just tap, 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 tap. This would go on for days and weeks into months, I don't know, however big they wanted to make the ring. Well, the rings, Dad wore one all his life, one he made that he showed us, and he had made a smaller one for Mom, and she always carried it in the drawer with all of her keepsakes. Then they decided they would show me how to make an ashtray. One of the artsy craftsy things these guys did was to make interesting stuff. And we had this around the house for years. My brother had it. It's a little worse for wear. It was a cigarette, an ashtray made from one of the 5-inch shells off of the big gun on the rear. And then the lighter was made from an anti-aircraft shell from one of the anti-aircraft guns. And the parts in the middle were part of that shell, so it would fit nicely in the middle of the 5-inch shell. And then parts of the anti-aircraft shell were cut off so that they could fit here, and then you could rest your cigarette and not have to worry too much about where it was going. But Dad used this for years in the 40s and 50s that I knew about, and then he stopped smoking, and it just kind of sat there for years and years and years, but we didn't want to get rid of it for obvious reasons. But that's another one of those World War II wonderful things that sailors and the machine shop and all of the stuff they have to work with on ships can do. Daddy had one that sat by his side of the bed because he smoked cigars. And when he got up in the morning, if there was one left from last night, he'd light it up and head down to fix coffee. On some Saturdays, Captain Angel would call in a few of the crew to listen to his favorite TV program, radio program that he could get by shortwave radio occasionally. And he loved his Wheeling, West Virginia jamboree. He loved his country and his bluegrass and whatever American music. And he'd pull out the schnapps bottle and everybody would have a little shot of schnapps and listen to country, Western music. I asked Dad one time about, as I got out this gorgeous piece of paper that had all kinds of nautical decoration on it from, fish and squid and I don't know, all mermaids and whatever. And it just fascinated me as a kid, and I'd ask Dad about it, and he said, well, that's what we got when we went across the equator. And okay, so that was it. And then as I got into young adulthood, I was been talking to some of the old guys at Roosevelt High School who had been in the Navy in the 1950s and so forth. I mean, they were old salts. And they got to laughing about something one day, and as I walked in, I said, well, I'm glad to hear y'all are having such a good time today. And they said, oh, we were remembering, the old days and crossing the equator. And I said, oh, can you tell me about crossing the equator? And they started laughing and said, no, ma'am. Sure can't do that right now. After I'd talked to these guys, the next time I saw Dad, I said, Dad, do you still have that old paperwork of crossing the equator? And he said, yeah, it's rolled up in there somewhere. And I said, well, can you tell me about what it was like to earn the right to go across the equator and to earn this piece of paper? He said, no, nothing I can tell my daughter right now. So he just would kind of blush and walk away. According to Dad, once they were at New Caledonia, where they stopped for fuel, I'm sure, after making the long trip across the Pacific Ocean, he got word from whoever there in New Caledonia that the Japanese knew that they were there and were headed someplace special. They were not allowed off the ship to go visit. That's when the captain realized that he needed to tell some of the crew why they were being contained on the ship. And that's when he was saying the Japanese know we're here and they know what we're doing and we've got to leave. So we need to finish refueling, evidently, and then we'll leave and head south. Instead of going this way, they went south around New Zealand, around Australia to Perth, and then to go to Bombay and then to Iran. This was considered almost a shooting gallery, this narrow body of water right in through here, that the Japanese and, pirates still to this day probably work that body of water more than a lot of them in that part of the world. Dad said when they went south of Australia and north of Antarctica to come up on Perth, he said that they went so far south it got very cold, and he realized he just didn't want to get any farther south towards Antarctica than they already were. And they then docked in Perth, and the guys got to have a little shore leave. They discovered a milk bar right next to a fruit stand, and the fruit stand had fresh strawberries, and the guys just thought those were those beautiful things that they had seen in a long time. And the milk bar had some ice cream, and they would go pick up the strawberries and mix them with the ice cream, and then we're showing some of the locals what they were doing. And the guy at the milk bar told them, get back to the ship. I don't want you showing these people how to ruin my milk products with strawberries. So they all laughed, and everybody laughed, but the milk bar owner wasn't laughing. Dad, I know, got shore leave because one of the things he brought back that we still have with us today and use is a K-bar knife. He said that it was made by the locals, so his K-bar knife looked exactly like a Marine K-bar knife at the time. And I said, well, how did you get it? And he said, I had an old torn blue shirt, chambray shirt. And he said, I just held the torn part, and the guy wanted it, so I gave it to him and grabbed that knife and ran and got it back to the ship. And as a kids, we used it to dig holes out in the backyard and do all kinds of things with Dad's good knife. My brother still has it, and it's still a treasure. From Abadan, as they were unloading, convoy after convoy came across Iran, driven by Russian women. Last week, I was talking with my brother about Dad's stories because I was telling him where we were going with this. And I said, Dad told me that when they reached Abadan, Iran, that there was a locomotive on the ship that was the big secret, or one of the big secrets. And I said, do you remember Dad ever telling you anything about these stories of what they were taking to Iran? And he told me, he said, well, Dad told me they were tanks. And I went, tanks of what? He said, no, military tanks. And I thought, oh. So then I got to thinking, yeah, I guess the Russians, Soviets at that time, really needed them. And then I got to checking on when these great tank battles were taking place in the Soviet Union. And I realized that today Volgograd, but Stalingrad fell in April, I believe it was, of 1943. And then there was the breakout where the Russians were chasing the Germans back across that steppe plain to the Ukraine and to Belarus. And they got to an area between Belarus and eastern Belarus and eastern Ukraine called Kursk. And that was the great Kursk breakout and the great battle, the greatest tank battle in the history of the world so far. Gee, the Soviets won. Dad said as they were all being unloaded by the local Iranian stevedores, he said they got to laughing at each other because they had to run water on the decks of the ship because it was so hot at the end of August that they were afraid that the ammunition would blow up on their ship. So they were kind of waiting around to see what was happening, and the stevedores came back on ship to kind of relax and wait for somebody to pay them, I guess. And he said that we all had been smoking cigars and a few cigarettes and had tossed them aside. And he said that stevedores had picked them up, and he said they were all barefooted, came back on the ship and were squatting on that hot deck, leaning up against the walls of the cabins. And he said when they'd finished their cigarettes and cigar smoking, then they would take that stub and put it under their big toe to tap it out. He said there really wasn't anything left of it, but he said, I couldn't understand how they could handle that hot a material. Here's Abadan, Iran, and the women that were driving the trucks had come probably from Turkmenistan and across Iran, or maybe across from the Caucasus mountain range, but had to come way across Iran. And all the drivers that were driving everything back to Russia were all women drivers. And they were the tank drivers too. So they filled up the tanks with fuel from those big drums, and then having lots more drums ready to fill them up when they got in need, going north, headed back to the Soviet Union across Iran. As the Germans were coming across and then trying to take Stalingrad. The Volga River comes into the Caspian Sea, and right up in through here is Stalingrad, and that's where all of these trucks were headed to support the Russian front. All of this Battle of Stalingrad lasted between 1942 and ended early in 1943, so it was in the middle of the winter time, and it was a cold hell for everybody. I got to go to the Soviet Union and in the summer of 1991, and one of the places we stayed for 4 or 5 days was Volgograd, the old Stalingrad. The hotel where we stayed was a nice hotel, and it was right on the edge of this very wide avenue of 2 street lanes, a wide walking lane with beautiful flowers and trees, and then 2 more traffic lanes going the other direction down the hill to the Volga River. And right across from our hotel was this circle street with a circular water fountain, I guess, and that's where we like to have our breakfast. We'd take our whatever we were having for breakfast and take it over across the street and sit there in the cool of the morning on that cool marble or whatever it was, and just enjoy the morning and watch Volgograd wake up, or at noon or any time of day. And then we walked down the hill a ways to some shops down there, and it was just a beautiful part of the town. And we were given a tour farther uptown, and where the holdouts during World War II were taking place, were the famous snipers, and by the railroad yards and some of the industrial area. And so we got to see that. Well, that was fine. And one of the kids, my students, asked me if I'd seen it, and I said, no, I didn't care. And he, well, don't you know what it's about? And I said, I think it's something to do with snipers. And he said, you got to see it. So I took it home, and I said, if I like it, we're on Soviet Union now, I'll bring it, and we'll see it. So I took it home and watched it, and I was, like I am, dumbfounded now, as it started with these thousands of men trying to be pushed across the Volga River. Those men were Russian soldiers, Russian conscripts, Russian farmers, and anybody that they could get into the boats. And if they ever turned around, they'd be shot. So they got across the river. And then every third person was given a rifle with a couple of bullets. And then you go up this hill into the face of the German Nazi fire. And if you turned around, the Russian officers would shoot them, because Stalin had said, you will take Stalingrad or else. I mean, that was the last hope of Russia. And by the time they finally made it to the top of the hill, and it showed that the sheer number of people, they were running out of bullets and the machine guns and so forth. When they got to the top of the hill, the machine gun nest was that beautiful area where we sat to have breakfast. And that lovely hill that we walked up through the gardens and the drive on either side was the place where those thousands of guys died, either being shot from behind because they were not fast enough, or wanted to go back because of the unrelenting German Nazi machine gun fire. To think that all of that carnage eventually saved that city and saved Russia, because once they got up there, that machine gun nest was taken down. The officers who were stored sleeping in that hotel, or they were ushered out. All of the other places, there was less than a mile of waterfront in Stalingrad there that had not fallen into German hands. And from there, they were able to push them back. Once the Nazis were pushed back, the Cossack cavalry was turned loose on those stragglers. This was in the spring of probably 43 or 44, from the winter. This war was going on in 43, 44. I had visited with a young lady in Rostov-on-Don. Her family are Cossacks, Don Cossacks, and they have a training stable there to learn how to ride Don Cossack style, and that's what she does on Sunday, because her grandpa started the school. Took me to her house, and I had supper with her mom and dad that evening. And she had a picture of her dad with his horse, and then the Soviet general, head of the Russian army there in the east, and her grandfather was the man in charge of teaching horsemanship to all these Russian soldiers. So he was being given an award of some kind. And as we sat around the table before eating the meal and toasting one another, I got to drink vodka toasts out of his silver stirrup cup. I was teaching at Roosevelt. I had a student from Germany whose dad was at the language school, and his grandpa was in the German army on that front. And it was so cold that he and his mates decided they would desert because they wanted, number one, to get warm, and they did not want to go back to Germany. So they were able to escape into Greece and make their way to safety and eventually back to Germany after the war was over. But he was a German army deserter that survived to have a family whose grandson got to come to the United States and be in my history class. From Abadan, Iran, they went south of Africa, and he said around the Cape, he said it took them 5 days to go 1 day's trip because of a huge storm they were into down there. He said it always fascinated me. I said, well, what was it like? He said, well, you walked on one wall and then on the passageway and then walked on the other wall as the ship rolled back and forth, literally on its sides. And they spent 5 days like that before they got out of it, and then went across to Montevideo, Uruguay. The Germans had two great battleships from the late 30s, the Bismarck and the Graf Spee, the sister ship. Bismarck was creating all kinds of havoc that the songs and the stories tell, and finally they were able to sink her, the good ship Hood. In the South Atlantic, the Graf Spee was creating the same kind of havoc with British shipping, European shipping, using South America evidently as its base of operation. When Dad and the good ship Cape Henlopen rounded South Africa, they were headed to a neutral port to take on more fuel, and that would have been Montevideo, Uruguay. As they entered the great estuary there between Argentina and Uruguay, in the great area, it's really not a harbor, but anyway, there were some evidence of a sunken ship, and of course Dad and them were asking, well, what was that? And the captain said, oh, that's the Graf Spee. Everybody knows that, a few months ago that it was sunk. The British weren't looking for it. It was in the South Atlantic, and they finally cornered it. The German captain decided he did not want to surrender, but he did not want his men to go down with the ship. So he sent them all on to Montevideo so that they could get off the sunken ship. And that was what Daddy got to see as they went in and out of Montevideo Harbor. Getting to visit nightclubs, day clubs, whatever they were doing there. German soldiers, French soldiers, sailors. I mean, it was a very international, interesting port, evidently. And from Montevideo, probably refueling, checking in. Then they went to Cuba probably to refuel and check in, and then to New York. When they get back, they'd have shore duty and pictures of them with their little SP, badges or armbands on that they'd be walking. He said you didn't want to do duty and whatever. There's portside bars and so forth were pretty tough parts of that New York port system. As I was listening to the news this morning about the strike that's going on with the longshoremen, they were interviewing some people at Red Hook in New York, the port facility there. And it dawned on me, Dad was saying, well, that some of the toughest places he was ever at was in New York at Red Hook. And he said that we'd go to the bars there and get us a beer or Boilermaker or whatever they were. I was too young to know at the time. Anyway, and then they would be on shore patrol to make sure that the other sailors were being treated nicely. But evidently, in the 1940s, Red Hook was a pretty tough part of town. May still be. Mother went to New York on at least two occasions that I can think of. One was fairly memorable because she realized that she was late getting to the train, which would take them to the airport and so forth. And in the process, she got on the plane and back to San Antonio almost, and then realized, I don't have my purse. She had her tickets and everything else in a little carry-on that was going to be for, for quick showing to the people at the airport. And she was able to make a contact call to Jesse before he left, and went and talked to the cab company, and they talked to the cabbie, and he said, oh yes, he said, I remember that sweet lady. And so he said, I've got it. So he brought it back so that Dad and could get it somehow back to Mom. And I'm not sure how they did it, but I know she did get her purse back. The next ship they got on was the Golden Eagle, which was a refrigerated ship, and it went back and forth hauling sides of beef and frozen food, cold food. And they left New York, and I'm not sure exactly where they were going, but they did go through the Caribbean. I asked Dad one time, did he get to see any submarines? He said no, but he said the ship that was next to them got hit by and sunk by a submarine, one next to us and one behind us in a way. And here's a picture of a destroyer escort. There were, I don't know how many, several dozen ships in the convoy, and then several of these escort destroyer type ships. Here's a picture of the Panama Canal that was taken. Dad's handwriting on the back says, this is the second time, he said, here's one of the locks at Panama. George Bowl was one of Dad's buddies in the Navy, and stayed a buddy after the war was over. As we would go to Rockport to go fishing in the 50s or 60s, we'd stop at his office. He was an insurance person. I think he had started out when he got out of the Navy to go to school to get his teaching certificate, and became a teacher, then a principal of schools there in Atascosa County, then a superintendent of schools, and then retired from that to get into the insurance and be a businessman in Pleasanton. So he did quite well for himself, and was interesting and had an interesting life himself. This map of the Eastern Pacific shows the movement from the Panama Canal over to Hawaii, where they took on fuel. One of the sailors on the ship, all I know is Bastroani, at least I think that's his name, had a brother who was in the U.S. Army, and Bastroani told everybody, he said, well, if we can get to Hawaii and if they'll let us off the ship, he said, I'll call my brother and we'll see about if we can't do some touring. So his brother brought one of those big old Army trucks. They all piled in the back and toured the island of Oahu, and got to see the palace, the old palace of the king. They got to see Diamond Head. They got just everywhere. One of the fun places Dad got to go was the Hawaiian Village, the cultural center. They got to see the dancing of the cultural persuasion, and brought home Mother a grass skirt and all the accoutrement. And I used to put that on as a kid, pull it out of the box, and it was all dried, and anyway, but it was fun. A few years later, in the 1970s, I did have a student who used to work at the cultural center. His sister was one of the dancers. Well, his mom taught dancing to the other girls that were coming in. And then he and his dad cooked the pigs and did all the other good stuff, including some of the male dancing. That's what he did. And from Hawaii, they were to sail to New Zealand. And they were in Auckland. And from Auckland, they were to pick up dozens and dozens of sides or whole beefs, cattle, from the neck down to the tail, and keep them in the freezer till they got wherever they were to go next. This is one of the ports in New Zealand where they were, and then outside the port is this friendly sign to all the sailors who arrive, letting them know where the various points of interest are on the islands. And you can see they're all Maori, M-A-O-R-I. Daddy called them the Maori Indians, and I did for a long time. Then I realized they're not Indians. They're the native people, original people of New Zealand. The lieutenant wanted to see the islands, so he rented a car. They filled up the back end of it with a tub of ice, beer, and set out to visit, see what was there. And it didn't get very far before they had a flat tire, and some farmers came over to help them, and there was a party going on. They opened the back end, started sharing iced beer, which was kind of a new one on those farmers who were all used to room temperature beer, and life was good. As they set off across New Zealand, I remember when we were visiting Harold Eckelman in Kansas, he was talking about how these rolling hills reminded him of eastern Kansas, and the rock that they could get out of to make fences. But the part of New Zealand they were in is a formerly volcanic area. It has geysers, still hot springs. There they are, and a beautiful resort there where the guys got to stay for a couple of days and do more visiting. You almost hate to say there's a war going on. It's so beautiful. And these were all pictures that were taken by the lieutenant or for the lieutenant, whoever had the camera. And then he made sure all the guys got copies. When talking about where Dad's ship, the Golden Eagle, was headed from New York with loads of either frozen or cooled products like beef and eggs and chicken and lamb and pork around the world, and 1944 was going back and forth. It would take a week to get from the United States to England, and then another week to get back home. And usually they were taking local products. One trip, I know he said there were hundreds of cases of good Scots whiskey and some other products of similar libacious nature from Great Britain. And yes, the sailors got to imbibe on the way home, and probably their families didn't want to know about it. But it was what they did. And they made it home safely, unloaded, reloaded with frozen products and refrigerated products, and headed back to one of the other ports to dislodge and feed troops that were getting ready for the invasion. They would be taking it to Liverpool or Bristol, and there it would be downloaded so that it could be literally feeding some of the American and Canadian troops, the British troops that were getting ready to invade Europe in June of 1944. The highlight of this voyage was our visit to London. It was very interesting and educational, as well as a lot of fun. The lieutenant granted permission so that all 6 of us could go together, and we left Avonmouth on the 8:35 train in the morning of February 29, 1944, making it very convenient to remember the date. We changed trains at Bristol and were soon speeding along the country rural side of England. It looked about the way I pictured it, with the many rolling hills resembling a huge warped checkerboard with alternating plowed fields and pasture lands. Rivers and streams are abundant and lined with trees, and although the trees are dormant, the pastures and hedge finches were dressed with their brightest spring green. As we sped by the landscape, basking in the none too warm sunshine, we passed several beautiful estates and numerous hamlets protected from the wind and the cold by groves of sturdy trees, and each with its own church or chapel that boasts a steeple regardless of its size. Our route took us through the cities of Bath and Reading, but like American cities, little can be seen from a train window. We arrived at Paddington Station, London at 1 p.m. Our first move was to satisfy our hunger and find a bed for the night. After getting the needed information from a bobby, we took a bus to Piccadilly Circus, which is the hub of the shopping district. The Red Cross Service Club was easy to find, and there we satisfied our stomachs, if not our palates. They assigned us to return to the main club, and here we enjoyed music of a Canadian orchestra, in which I indulged in a Coke and donuts. A bit reluctantly, we started for Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, and upon the advice of an American lady at the Red Cross. It took about half a minute to rid ourselves of any doubts, as the first glance promised anything but a dull exhibition. We left our world of famous friends just as the pubs opened. So for the next 2 hours, we indulged in some of England's mediocre brew, which, after eating, we started to via the underground subway to U, with the multitudes calmly heading for the safety of the underground, which also serves as the air raid shelters. We bravely went out into the streets to see what happened and to be the target of the evening. Only 12 planes had come over fairly high, and there were no casualties, according to the next morning's paper at least. When the all clear was sounded, we had a couple more beers and returned to our bunks. 10 o'clock the next morning found us shaved, breakfast over, loaded into a funny little London taxi for an hour or two that covered the main points of interest in London. Dad and the guys that he was with were in a pub and talking with some of the locals who were bomb technicians, and what their job was to be stationed, like for example in St. Paul's Cathedral, and if a bomb dropped at St. Paul's, then they would jump on top of it and defuse it before it went off. And I get goosebumps just thinking of the hundreds into the thousands of Londoners, Britishers, and whoever else came to help to learn how to defuse all of these rockets that were coming in, legitimate bombs that were falling from airplanes, and how any of them survived. Our next stop was St. Paul's Cathedral, which is a masterpiece of architecture by Sir Christopher Wren. Its dome is the second largest in the world and is 400 feet from the floor to the cross at the top of the dome. Its seating is capacity of 4,000. The cathedral cost $6 million to build and narrowly missed being completely demolished by a time bomb. It crashed through the roof, the floor, and then buried itself in the floor of the crypt. One of those short-lived squads that handles time bombs arrived. One of those short timers found that the handles of the time bomb arrived and removed the time detonator just to find that it was set for 15 minutes. They had saved this historic spot by only seconds. We passed many of the world's renowned buildings, including Lloyd's of London, the Bank of England, and across the Thames River twice via the Tower of London and the bridge and London Bridge, and then the beautiful Tower Bridge. Here we passed the prison where Rudolf Hess has the distinction of being the most recent prisoner to reside there. We stopped before but didn't enter the All Hallows Church where William Penn was baptized and John Adams was married. Passing Scotland Yard and Downing Street, we got our first glimpse of Big Ben and the Tower of London. Like Congress, the House of Commons and the House of Lords both meet in the Parliament building. Our next stop was that most famous Westminster Abbey, where we visited the tombs of such noted people as Dr. Livingstone, Charles Dickens, Longfellow, Tennyson, various kings, queens, and other members of the royalty. Concluding our tour, we passed the bombed district of the previous week. One tour bus took us through the devastated area of the 1941 and 42 Blitz. Block after block, mile after mile that was formerly homes, stores, or factories were now flat, desolate, and completely waste area. And back to the Red Cross just in time for chow. Most of the afternoon was spent doing little sightseeing on our own while searching for water. We had our final meal at the Red Cross early and bid London adieu, and then with our blacked out train left at 6:30 p.m. We arrived aboard ship tired and hungry 4 hours later, and were very pleased and happy to have had an opportunity to visit the many historic spots and truly beautiful homes. We're thankful that our loved ones had been spared the agonizing hours of death and destruction these English people have gone through. Harold Ott Payne. Dad brought back some pictures. I don't know how he got them, how they were purchased or whatever, but they're pictures of downtown London after the Blitz of the late 30s by the Germans. They would be the V2 and the buzz bombs that the Germans were coming up with. Here's, well, Russia and the Kola Peninsula. And right about here, out of the Arctic Ocean, is a river and goes down. And right about here is the port of Murmansk. This was the only port that the Western powers could get to help supply Russia. The big fights had gone on out here in Volgograd, or at that time Stalingrad, and then ended up over here at Kursk. And so by the time, the late 40s, the Russians needed help, and all the food was coming in to supply the Russians in this area. So this Murmansk became a critical need for getting food and military supplies up there. Dad was coming from New York and the East Coast and across the Atlantic Ocean. So there's just a lot of ships traffic coming across, trying to supply all of these combatants. And the most dangerous one seems to be the one that takes so long. Is called the Murmansk Run. And once they left the Atlantic fleet that was just going back and forth, and it was a turkey shoot there sometimes with the German submarines acting, and, well, Italian every once in a while. It was a nasty one because it was, again, just a shooting gallery. And if you got to in a sinking ship up here in this cold Arctic water, you really didn't last long. Dad told us one time, he said, I met a guy, we pulled him out of the water, and I didn't really know what that meant at the time. And he said he was covered with oil, and his hair had white patches and white streaks in it. And he said he kind of looked like a skunk to me. And we got to talking to the guy after we got him cleaned up and said, what's going on? He said, that's the third ship I've had shot out from under me on this Murmansk run. And we said, well, what's in Murmansk? And he said, those people are starving up there. He said, the food they get goes down south to the Russian army, so they don't have very much at all. And if we can get them any food, they can get some for themselves and then get enough to send to the army, besides the military supplies that we take to them also. So Dad learned a little bit about the vagaries of war. In 1989, in the summer, I got to escort 30 kids to the Soviet Union. And one of the stops we made was in Murmansk. And we were being introduced to some of the locals there, and there was this little 80-year-old lady, looked like she was about 4'11". Maybe she was 5'2", but she was petite. And she got to telling us about life in Murmansk during the Second World War. She was a stevedore on the docks there. All the men were fighting, pulling triggers, setting mines, doing whatever they could to fight other German soldiers. The women, just like the ones that picked up the tanks in Iran, were the ones that were supporting and doing critical work also. And her job was to unload the ships of all the military supplies and food so that Russia could sustain itself in World War II. When she finished speaking, I walked up to her and said, I'd like to introduce myself and tell you thank you for what you said. And I told her what my dad had said about a fellow he had picked up out of the water. And her eyes just brightened up, and she said, oh, those men, those sailors that came in with all those ships and all the food, and sometimes if they'd been there before, they brought us food and brought us clothing, shoes or socks. And she said, we just thought it was the greatest thing. And she said, would you please go home and give your dad a kiss for me for all the things that the United States Navy did for the people of Murmansk? So I gave Dad a kiss for her when I got home, and he blushed, yeah. When the ship is docked in Naples, they are offloading all kinds of foodstuffs. I don't know what they were taking over, but that was their job as a refrigerated ship. Sometimes it was eggs, sometimes it was frozen food, fruits, vegetables that could be kept in a refrigerated, not frozen, but refrigerated capacity. And they also had freezers where they were taking all kinds of frozen product also. So they unloaded and were supplying the foods and needs of the U.S. Army that was just on the north side of Rome. After they had docked in Naples, and the lieutenant decided that he, Jesse, and George needed to see Vesuvius because it had erupted a few months earlier, and almost, well, halfway buried one little town on its northern edge. So they got to see that and then walk up the little, it looks like funicular tracks, little railway tracks up the side of Vesuvius. And we used to have some lava from Vesuvius, but I took it to school one time and I probably left it with a teacher or something, who knows. So we don't have that anymore, but I know that there was Vesuvian lava in my childhood past. This is the guy that led his crew all over the world. The lieutenant decided they needed to head to Rome because he was wanting Jesse and anybody who wanted to go, but it was Jesse and George and the lieutenant that ended up going. The lieutenant had created orders for whoever wanted to go, and they had to sleep on them overnight, wrinkle them, make them look like they were official orders. And they all were ready to hit the road. So when they were there, he said they could hear the big guns north of the city, but it was pretty much in Allied hands when they were there. So when that was, I'm not sure. They saw some big army trucks with troops headed to the front lines. And I'd asked Dad, I said, well, once I got older, and said, well, did you get to talk to the guys on the front lines? He said, no. He said they were in no mood to talk. They were serious. And he said they thought we were maybe some kind of secret squirrels or something. They didn't want to talk to us at all. So, okay. So when they got to Rome, they were let out and wandered around to talk to people to see where the Vatican was, and the lieutenant came back and he said, I know where it is. It's not too far from here, so let's go. So they walked over and got to one of the entrances, but did not go in at that time because it was being sealed off from the regular people. It was not a tourist attraction at that moment. The lieutenant said, well, we can't get in right now, but he said, we're coming back tomorrow. He said, let's go to the Red Cross and see if we can't get a room for the night. So the lieutenant went in and he came back out and he said, fellas, he said, only officers here. You're going to have to find your own meal and your own shelter. So they waved goodbye and started walking. George and Daddy started walking down the street, and what are we going to do? We don't speak Italian. You speak Spanish pretty good. I don't speak Spanish, and it's Italian. So they were walking along, and this young man, he said he wasn't more than 10 or 11 years old, was with a donkey and a cart, and he said, would you guys, he said it was broken English, but wanted to know if we wanted a place to eat and stay. And we thought, what's wrong with this picture? But then we thought, well, what the heck, we're two big guys. So he said, well, come to my house with my mom and my aunt. So they said, oh, well, okay. So they went, and he thought, well, we're going to get a little tiny house someplace that's back in some little corner. And he said when the kid turned the corner and went through this wrought iron gate, he said there was this huge 2-story mansion. So they went in and met his mother and aunt. They were interested in finding out what they wanted to do. Would you like a meal? And I said, yes, we'd appreciate a meal and a place to stay. So they said, yeah, we can do that. So they said they fixed us one of the best meals we'd ever had. outside of mom and grandma's cooking back home. And then they showed us, it was getting late, and after some kind of conversation, and they took us to our room where we would spend the night. And he said it was a big, huge, a double bed with a cover over it, up to the ceiling. And he said it was a huge ceiling, just huge room. He said, I've never been in a bedroom that big. So he said the next morning we had a good night's sleep, got up, could take a bath of sorts, and went down for breakfast, which was not bad, but he said it was obvious that we probably ate them out of house and home the night before. So we took what money we had and left it with them, and then the young man took us back to the Vatican so we could catch up with the lieutenant. And the lieutenant had gotten us in after arguing with one of the guards that we were his orderlies, and he was not going anywhere without his orderlies. So we got to go in with him, standing alongside all of these other admirals and generals from the French and Italian, well, maybe not Italian, but all these other armies and navies that were on the Allied cause. And Pope Pius XII was honoring them for the victory and freeing Rome from the Italians and the Germans, probably. So they were standing around kind of figuring out what are we going to be doing? How do you do anything? And George Bowl was a Catholic, as was the lieutenant. Daddy was not. He was not churched at that time. Really didn't know who the Pope was. And he told us in the stories, he said, I was looking around, he said, there was this little canopy looking thing coming, kind of bouncing down through this door. And he said, then got to noticing people started getting down on their knees. And he said, I couldn't imagine why you'd be getting down on your knees in this beautiful place. And he said, and then all of a sudden this guy in this white outfit got out of that chair that was bouncing down just through here. And he said then he started shaking hands, and people were kissing his ring and kneeling and kissing his ring, and then he would, shake hands with them and speak with them. And he got in front of the lieutenant, and the lieutenant knelt, and George knelt and kissed his ring and said a couple of words to him, and got in front of me, and I just stayed standing and reached my hand across and held it out to him, and he grabbed it, and we shook hands, and I said, I'm Jesse James from Somerset, Texas. He said, this guy in white said, oh, I've heard of Texas before. He said, I would like to visit there one day. And he said, well, we'd just love to have you come and visit us. So he said, well, I've got to go down visit others. So Pope Pius went on down the line and started blessing and talking to all these other admirals and generals who were bowing and kneeling and kissing his ring as they were talking to him also. When it was over with, George and the lieutenant I think forever, did not let Daddy forget the fact that he was the only one in that room standing and shaking hands with the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. And Dad couldn't understand why they were so upset, because he thought he'd done a pretty good job welcoming that man to Texas. Anyway. In the spring of 1984, I was teaching U.S. history, Reconstruction to present, and we were getting into modern U.S. history. And I realized we're coming up on World War II, and gee, my dad was there, and I better start asking him some questions, because there's the history book, and then there's people that were there to make that history. So I asked him, I said, well, where exactly were you? And he said, well, I was at D-Day. And I said, well, on the ship? And he said, yeah. And he said, we were right in front of the battleship Texas. And he said, in fact, when the Texas would shoot its shells, they went over our ship, and we screamed and hollered, yay, go Texas, and so forth. He and George was born in Devine and lived in Pleasanton, Texas for his adult life. So he and George were having a good time, screaming and hollering at the big shells that the Texas could shoot over them and land, miles inland or whatever. It's big doings. And then they could see the people headed to the beach. And I asked him at that point, I said, if you were there, did you get to see anything? And he said, we weren't there to actually in the landing, but he said, you remember Pardner, don't you? And I said, well, yeah, he was on the hunting lease with Daddy and others. And he said Pardner was on the first or second wave that hit the beach. And it gave me an aback. I thought, and he's still alive and with us? And he said, yeah. He said he said they told him, the general that was giving them the orders for the day told him, he said, we expect 95 to 98% casualties on the first 3 waves of men that hit the beach. So go with God, best of good wishes, but we depend on you. And he was one of the men. He was wounded, but he survived the day to live to tell about what it was like to be on that sandy beach of Normandy. In the 1980s, I was into American history. And I'd asked Dad if he had ever heard of the Mulberries, because that was on a television program. And he said, oh yeah, he said, when we were in Liverpool, he said, we watched them go by. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we were coming in and out of Liverpool picking up supplies. And he said some of the Mulberries had been built a little bit farther up the coast, and some of them near Liverpool. Anyway, they were beginning to move them into position from the west coast of England down the coast so that they could be ready to go in place, so that all of the supplies on all the ships that were there waiting, dozens and dozens of ships, supply ships, were ready to start unloading onto the ducks, the amphibious cars, and they would be driving them, some of them loaded and going on shore, and some of them picking them up and offloading onto trucks that were driving out on the Mulberries. But as people that have looked on television, there was a big storm that almost soon after all the Mulberries were put into place, and one of them was completely destroyed and the other one was in not good shape, but they did get it in better shape so they could unload some more supplies that they could haul inland faster. in looking through Dad's pictures for years and years, from the time I was a little, probably 3 and 4 year old kid, just looking at pictures, there was one that I didn't pay any attention to because it was almost completely gray or very, very unclear with anything in it that I could tell. And when I started darkening it so that the elements of the picture became clearer, I started crying, because it is a boxcar with that star on the top, which to me is United States Army, confiscated the train or whatever. And there are 3 or 4 soldiers in there not with smiles on their faces, but looking resolved. They got a job to do, don't want to do it, but they got to do it. And they're headed east. As I looked at this picture, it also dawned on me they're on a train track and the picture's being taken from above. So this is a road from between Le Havre to Paris. And Lieutenant or somebody took the picture as they were passing over and as the train was passing under as they were headed to Paris. Paris has fallen, and the Battle of the Bulge can't be far behind. They are the hope for our country to make sure that Germany loses that damn war. Once Dad and George and the lieutenant, Herb Jones, got to Paris, Dad said that they met up somehow with some Marines. They were beginning to recognize that the Navy Shore Patrol knew that they were not supposed to be in Paris. In fact, they weren't supposed to be in Le Havre. They were supposed to be on their ships because the war was still going on. But the Marines, I don't know if it was for a sense of humor or what, but said, well, we work at night and sleep during the day, so you can go out and play during the daytime and come in and sleep at night when we're not there. So for a couple of days that they were in Paris, I don't know exactly how long they were there, but at least 2 days, then that's what they did. Shore Patrol had heard that there were sailors loose, and so they were still dodging the Shore Patrol while they were in Paris. They did happen to get some perfume. Mother had 3 bottles of perfume. One of them was Joy. I remember that because of the design on the cover of the lady with the dress and holding one hand up and whatever, in joyous celebration. And the other ones I don't remember, but they were. All I remember is I had seen other very fine perfumes with those shaped bottles. And they were still sitting on Mother's dresser when she passed away and when Dad passed away. And I think we ended up putting them in the trash or Goodwill or something because they were just, I don't think they'd ever been used. But they were there with lots of love. But there was this lady that he got them from, and she had some friends that were perfumeries. And she said that if they wanted some perfume, she said she had some downstairs in her house. She said she had hidden it from the Germans because she did not want them to have her fine perfumes. And if he wanted some, then, follow me. So they went downstairs and into a little office and supply place looking thing and traded. I don't know what they traded or how much it cost, but he walked out with 3 little bottles of perfume for Mom. And life was good. When I asked Dad where he was on VE Day, he said, "Oh, New York." And I said, "Well, where in New York?" "Well, Times Square." If you weren't at Times Square, you were in a bar at Red Hook or somewhere near the docks, and being on shore patrol and trying to keep the other sailors from getting too drunk and falling in the the Sound. And anyway, And I asked him, I said, well, what was going on? And he said, well, he said, Times Square was just massed full of people. And he said, we were just walking around, kind of just being there and laughing. And then they came home. And this was not necessarily a nightclub, but just a nice steakhouse. Daddy never had alcohol in the house. As a kid, Daddy had these, Mom probably, had these in those old-fashioned albums that had a thick manila paper to them with little corners that you could stick on. Anyway, the corners were always coming off, and as I was looking, trying to get the pictures out to look at them. But we had that for so many years, and I finally ended up tossing those old albums out and putting them in these fine new albums. And I still liked to wander through them and see the pictures and remember myself asking Dad, tell me about this picture, tell me about this picture. And that's when I learned about who Captain Angel was. Oh, and I learned about who all the guys and in his unit there at Great Lakes Naval Training Center. Got to learn who some of the other fellas were that were on his ship. There we go. And to see the pictures where all the fellas are at work. That fascinated me because they were all on different parts of the ship. And then there's the guns, and that was fascinating to me, how many men it took to operate that big 5-inch gun off the rear. And then the anti-aircraft guns, and just didn't know enough to be scared of them or concerned about them, but just interested. And then there were the places he visited, New Zealand, and when we visited his friend in Kansas, Harold Eckelman, we were driving with the Eckelmans around eastern Kansas, and Harold remarked to Dad, this was in about 1954, and Harold remarked to Dad, doesn't this remind you of New Zealand? And Dad said, yeah, it does. And look at those stone fence posts. So I began listening more carefully to things Daddy would say with his friends because I found that I was learning so much about the world beyond my little bedroom and house and lot and dogs and friends and kitties. If I could listen to Dad talking with his friends and about his friends, because they were saying such important things, such interesting things that I thought I needed to know. And it's been a help for me as I've grown older and wiser, I hope. And I still, in my late 70s, sometimes think about Mom and Dad and am I doing things the way that it should be done, if it's okay with them. And I realize that they have given me a conscience and an interest in doing the right thing, the best of my ability.
Thank you, Mom.
So thank you, Mom and Dad, Lieutenant Herb Jones, Harold Eckelman, George, just everybody. You've made me the person I am today too.